Floating marshes, can they be a big part of the Delta's future? Can they help solve some of the climate change risks, some of the earthquake risks? Can they help solve some of the ecosystem restoration needs? Can they reduce the amount of carbon dioxide being released by the Delta and stop subsidence? In the next 10 minutes, I'd like to explore in greater detail the benefits we're trying to solve with a floating marsh. How did we get to this point? What have we accomplished so far? What have we learned, and what do we still need to research? And finally, why I believe floating marshes have the potential to be a huge game changer for the Delta. Have you ever been in the Delta and noticed chunks of peat floating around? In 1980, when the levee broke at Web Tract, chunks of peat the size of a house were floating around. It's extremely important to me to recognize the funding for this project from MWD and the support from Randall Nudek and Russ Ryan at Metropolitan. And the project never would have happened had it not been for the science and on-the-ground implementation provided by Steve Deverell and his team at HydroFocus. Subsidence has created so many problems for the Delta. We have a hole that's about 2.5 billion cubic meters, and trying to accrete would take decades. Wouldn't it be nice to connect up all these various patches of restoration and create the scale, connectivity, and gradients like the Delta used to have? Dealing with subsidence has been a career-long passion of mine, as you can see in this 1996 article from the Contra Costa Times, where I'm quoted as saying, "We should have never reclaimed these deep peat islands." Floating marshes were observed historically in the Delta. We think their biomass productivity may rival that of dendritic marshes, with potentially very good productivity for native fish species. Let's quickly review the problems we're trying to solve.
The critical thing that is too often missed in the Delta is the Delta is not sustainable in its current form.
This narrow winding channel is one of the few remaining places that resemble the historic Delta as it once was.
So if we go back just 150 years, this place was 300,000 to 400,000 acres of very wild wetlands and riparian forests and rivers and channels. So over 5,000 miles of waterways, wildlife, salmon that were 5 feet long, grizzly bears and elk and beaver. It was just a tremendously wild place. Over the last 150 years, we have levied and drained and removed about 98% of this former wetland and riparian forest that used to exist in the Delta. So for somebody who was here 150 years ago to come would not recognize this place today.
That transformation has taken its toll on the ecosystem. The robust habitat and food web that native species evolved in are nearly gone, and many fish populations are in decline. It is inevitable. The Delta as we know it is constantly changing, and that will continue. Whether by climate change, earthquakes, or other factors, forces will permanently alter this place and the benefits it provides to the region and all of California.
The 3 S's, I like to say, so we got subsidence and sea level rise and seismic, are the 3 S's, the big drivers of change.
Due to reclamation of the islands and farming practices over the years to dewater the saturated soils, the Delta's peat soils are rapidly oxidizing, vaporizing, causing a phenomenon known as subsidence. That is, the land surface is dropping as these highly organic soils oxidize into the atmosphere.
One way to get a visual image of that is that the Delta is losing about 2,300 dump truck loads of dirt every single day.
Sea levels in the Delta have been gradually rising for thousands of years. Some climate change models forecast potentially severe, widespread impacts, which could include permanent flooding and significant salinity intrusion.
We're here in Liberty Island, and the consequences of a flooded island, you can see a large expanse of water here, and if we continue down the path we're currently continuing, we may see more of these kinds of flooded islands in the Delta. The need for action is high because every day that goes by, the Delta is continuing to sink lower and lower. Every day that goes by, seas are rising a little bit more and more, And every day that goes by, the faults are gaining additional strain before they break. And so these risks are increasing every day we delay.
Now that we understand the problems that floating marshes can help solve, let's talk about what the project is. In 2005, a 10-acre chunk of peat popped as part of the Montezuma Wetlands project. This really got the creative juices flowing. In 2018, Steve Deverell harvested some small blocks of peat from the 14-acre subsidence reversal ponds that I led the creation of in 1997. Steve then placed these in a small pool in his backyard and watched them continue to float and grow. With this success, we wanted to expand.
We're here on Twitchell Island, out in the middle of the western delta. We're standing about 25 feet below sea level as a result of long-term subsidence. And we're starting a project that's very exciting in terms of the potential for stopping and reversing subsidence. So as we walk over here, I want you to see how we're harvesting peat mats that we're going to be transporting over to Bolden Island and placing in doughboy pools as part of the initial pilot project experiment.
We hired Carson Jeffrey's group at UC Davis to help conduct some research out there. Our research looked at how varying residence time and percent cover would affect productivity. Check out the size of the biomass that's underwater. In this simple chart, note that the zooplankton production and abundance in the floating marshes is 3 times that of the inlet water coming from the river. Where are we headed? What does the future hold? We're currently trying to connect our floating marshes to ponds to see if we can't help propagate native fishes. And we're also trying to move some of these floating marshes out into the McCallum River in a controlled way to see how they behave in a more riverine setting. In review, we think we have some significant benefits associated with floating marshes. Productivity, potentially reduced levee miles to maintain, reduces the accommodation space and the impacts of earthquakes and climate change, reduces carbon emissions, but we also have some major hurdles. We know that setback levees are expensive, very expensive. We need willing landowners, and it's going to take time to scale up. The vision I have is that we will build setback levees. We will plant and grow and float marshes, and then we'll create these long, broad corridors of habitat along the major migration corridors. We definitely have some critical research questions that need to be addressed. We need to better understand productivity, how we export that productivity, what kind of utilization by native species, what are the DO, dissolved oxygen and cooling effects. Will predators like these floating marshes? If we put the floating marshes out in a channel, how will we deal with flood conveyance? And then there's sediment deposition within these flooded islands or setback levees. Long-term management is another issue. Finally, once we've grown hundreds of acres of thick rhizome mat, how do we harvest or cut the mats free on a large scale so the mats will float? For this project to succeed, Metropolitan needs partners, researchers, and collaborators. We need your help. It's going to take a collective effort.
In a place with many competing interests, change in the Delta has been slow to come.
We need to get back to a sustainable delta, one that can withstand rising seas, earthquakes, get away from islands subsiding, and restore habitat to some semblance of what it used to be in the delta. We need to work on solutions that move the delta forward instead of backwards, so that our kids and grandkids and great-grandkids can enjoy a delta that is going to persist into the future.